Welcome to Chalk Dust, the podcast that gives you a front row seat into some of the best classrooms in the world. I'm Dr. Nathaniel Swain.
And I'm Rebecca Birch.
I'm a teacher and teacher educator at La Trobe University, and I've previously worked as a classroom teacher in primary school settings around Melbourne. I have the great pleasure to work with loads of schools around Australia on their instructional practice and school improvement.
And I'm the academic in residence at a girls' school in Sydney and a practicing English teacher. I'm currently studying towards a PhD on the link between explicit teaching and non-academic outcomes.
So there are lots of great conversations about teaching and education happening around the world right now, and Rebecca and I are known for getting right down into the nitty-gritty of classroom instruction.
There are already so many fantastic podcasts out there about evidence-based practice, and we're so excited to bring you one more. But this one has a distinctive difference.
Each episode, Rebecca and I break down real classroom footage and try to illuminate the moments that make great teaching great.
Teaching is both a science and an art. There are proven techniques that we know to work, but applying them in real classrooms is where the complexity lies. And that's where we come in.
We're here to slow things down, analyse what's happening, and connect the moves teachers make to the research on how students learn best. We'll pause the play, explore the rationale behind the key moments, and discuss the choices teachers make in real time.
The goal? To help you develop the eye of an expert observer so you can see what makes lessons effective and apply those insights into your own teaching or coaching practice. You can listen to an audio version of the podcast where you'll hear commentary on the practices as well as real audio from the classroom. Or you can watch the video version for all the visual detail. Check out the resources in the show notes, where you'll find all the platforms and versions and other resources to forward to your friends and colleagues.
Before we start our first episode, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're recording from and where you may be listening. Here in Melbourne, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations and pay my respect to elders past and present.
And I'd like to pay my respects to the Gadigal people on whose lands I'm recording today.
One of the great resources, Rebecca, that we're going to draw upon in this podcast is Teach Like a Champion. And if you don't know about Uncommon Schools and Doug Lemob's work, there's a video library which is really extensive that you can access by purchasing the latest edition of the book, Teach Like a Champion 3.0. There's also a blog that Doug writes. It includes lots of free video content and excellent discussions as well.
Yeah, and one of the big sets of techniques we see work beautifully in classrooms we work in is checking for understanding. This involves teachers asking questions or giving a short task to see if students are learning while the lesson's still unfolding.
It's a powerful teaching practice, and a lot of CfUs involve a pattern of teaching first, asking a question, checking responses as a class, and giving feedback. But that's not the only way to do it.
That's right. The video we're going to watch today is by an Australian teacher, and she's the first teacher to be recorded for Teach Like a Champ. Her name's Rebecca Sloots, and she's up in Queensland. What we're about to see is her check for understanding after she's taught students what a poem is. She asks students to complete a written response to explain why the example is in fact a poem. Shall we watch, Nathaniel?
Let's do it.
I'm going to go straight to and you do it actually, because you guys are going to do it straight away today with an everybody writes. I'm going to get you to read through the poem. Then I want you to tell me, how do you know that it is a poem? What does it have that tells you it is a poem? We ready? Silent, solo, go. How do you know it is a poem? Doesn't have. Good. I like that I'm hearing some of the terminology we've been learning. Okay, about 1 more minute. Everyone's got something similar and something different.
I was going to comment first and foremost on the routine. It seems like students really know what is expected of them, and they're jumping straight into that task. She said silent, solo, go. So there's a real emphasis in that routine and how quickly they jumped into it.
It seems like this is something they do pretty regularly. Yeah, they definitely knew what to do next. I was thinking about this as a check for understanding, is that often with EDI, we think first about verbal responses or something that's really kind of quick and one kind of signal to say, has everyone got this?
And EDI, in case anyone doesn't know, is explicit direct instruction, and it's probably one of the go-to ways of thinking about explicit teaching that a lot of people use, by Hollingsworth and Ybarra.
I think sometimes in the humanities, hits a bit of a limit when we're going for something a bit more qualitative. So as she's walking around, I'm hearing her, ask students to use the terminology of poetry to write their responses. And so she really wants to see that they can not only understand it, but they can express something about it. So I think in English in particular, you have to be able to actually do something with that understanding. Usually you have to write it down in some way, and writing is really the emphasis. So making sure at that early stage that they can do that is really important.
I think obviously writing it down crystallizes some of that great thinking that they might be having, and potentially formalizes some of the language there that might be more casual when they're doing a verbal response, perhaps.
Yeah. Should we keep
All right, let's keep watching. Jinx.
5, 4, finishing up your sentence, 3, 2, 1, and go. Before I hear what you have written, I'm going to get you to do a turn and talk with your partner. So when you turn to your partner, you're listening to make sure that the things they're saying actually relate to a poem. Okay? Showing shell in 3, 2, 1. Beautiful. Hands up. What does it have? How do we know it's a poem? We're still waiting on a couple of hands. Excellent. All hands up. Aurelia, what does it have?
Because it has stanzas and rhyming words.
Excellent. It has stanzas and rhyming words. James. Beautiful. It has 4 lines in each stanza. Riley J.
It isn't full sentences.
Correct. It's not a full sentence. Ravish.
It has a mood.
It does have a mood. Whoa. Have a think about what that mood might be. Eliza. Excellent. There is. Okay, hands down.
I think one of the cool things there is that the pairs are an opportunity for them to check their responses and to share what they've got, but it might also be a way for them to prompt those people who might not yet have their ideas together. What did you think of that, Rebecca?
Yeah, I think that talking to peers prompts them sometimes, the lower achieving students, around language they might have forgotten. They might not have rehearsed that language enough. So it just gives them that extra opportunity to rehearse that language so that when they go to write, they've got something really kind of a bit more technical and, a bit more meta language in their response. And I find it kind of interesting that she asks for all hands up. How do you feel about that versus cold calling? So cold calling is when we ask students to respond without, not without notice, but without sort of announcing who we're going to ask. What do you think is the utility of having all hands up in this particular instance, Nate?
So for me, I think that the all hands up serves the same purpose in that everyone should be expected to respond, and she doesn't move on until all hands are up. I think it's just a nice way of mixing up that questioning strategy so that students know that they really want to be ready to answer, and also that their response really matters. Another way I've seen some teachers use it is they might say, when you've got an answer, can you lock it in? And they'll do a verbal or a visual symbol like this that shows that they're ready to answer. And when the teacher sees that there's enough hands going like this, then they will jump into it and get started. So I think whether you do all hands up like we saw, where we get lots of energy and excitement, or whether you get them to lock it in like that, it's just a way of them knowing as a cohort that anyone's answer and everyone's answer does matter.
Do you know, I noticed too that, after a pair share, everyone's going to have a response of some kind. So it's a very safe, environment to have a go and put your hand up. If you haven't got a response, you can always steal your neighbours. And I think this kind of check for understanding, because it's not necessarily a right or wrong check for understanding, I think that's really very different to having to get the data of 100% accuracy from the whole class, because what you're actually doing is you're collecting a range of responses that students can then choose what they're going to take on board to do their written response. So it's a bit sort of qualitatively different to just something like a hinge question, where we just need everyone to have that 100% understanding or a concept or a fact before they move on.
So it's not like a multiple choice where you have got A, B, C, or D. One or two of them are correct and the others are incorrect, and you're looking for misconceptions. But really, it's as you said, it's collecting different responses. And for those students who need more time or opportunities to process what they might be formulating as their response, they can hear other examples from their peers, or to hear how people are stretching their responses to go further using more elevated language or more detailed concepts potentially.
Yeah. And what do you think about this sort of using peer feedback before they move on, just at that primary school level? How do you find it works with students who are a bit younger?
Look, I think helping peer feedback be really accountable. So I really love accountable student talk in the way that pair shares allow that to happen. I love that there is a task that they do beforehand as well here. So they're not giving feedback on a verbal response, which is flippant and reactive. It's everyone's had a minute in this case, to write a response. So the peer feedback is quite targeted and quite adjustable based on how students are going. I think if you've got good parameters around it, you can have really productive conversations and make it work really well. What I also love is that when they're starting off with writing, they get to engage in what's sometimes called generative learning, where it's not just the teacher has given them one correct answer and their job is to regurgitate that one correct answer. They've given explicit instruction in whatever the target of the lesson is, but students have to do the heavy lifting of generating not just one possible response, but potentially a few different responses and making those new connections themselves, which I think is really nice.
And how would you compare that to study? So I guess give us a non-example of an activity that would not be generative learning.
Say that they had a sentence that they had to write, but there was only really one way to end that sentence, and all they're doing is taking information the teacher gave them a minute ago and plugging it into the right position. So you might be reading a text and you can see the answer directly in the text. It doesn't require them to connect to other things that they have to think of before, or doesn't require them to generate new potential examples that generalize the concept, for example. So I think, I think that there's opportunities there where those base level questions might be helpful to establish meaning. But you want to be stretching your students further so that if you are teaching explicitly, it's not for the purpose of one-word answers or simple responses. So Rebecca, thinking about using explicit teaching or EDI, for example, in the humanities, is there anything that teachers need to think differently about compared to other subjects?
Yeah, look, I think explicit direct instruction is a really good lesson sequence for starting off a lesson and getting to some foundational understandings before you move on with the substantive part of the lesson. So I've noticed these kids are a little bit sort of upper primary, a bit older. I think this applies for basically, years 3 to 10, although I've used EDI in 11 and 12 as well. I think with the humanities, because we're working towards larger pieces of work and it is quite iterative, I don't think EDI necessarily accounts for things like dialogue, co-construction, planning, idea generation and editing. So there's a lot that it doesn't cover. It is a fantastic way to alleviate workload and to make sure that all students are at a certain point before you begin. But I do think that we need to have these dialogic conversations, even like in this case around quality. So we're about to see a bit more around, the qualitative features of a particular example. And we need to carve out time for that. So we know that EDI will only get us so far, and we need to plan for these opportunities. Now, the other thing I'll say about this sequence as well is that it is kind of a good thing to do on the fly as well. So as this teacher's walking around, as Rebecca's walking around her classroom, she's seeing the quality of those responses. Now, she might have planned this to the nth degree where she's asking them to revise and edit, and this might be part of her everyday practice. But on the other hand, she might have actually seen what was coming up in the responses and thought, okay, I think we can do better. So sometimes making space to be responsive to the quality that's coming at you can be really valuable as well. And that's where sort of EDI leaves off and teacher expertise comes in.
I also like, and I think a logical connection to this is when you're reading text or delving into content where there isn't one answer you're looking for. You're looking for multiple interpretations. You're looking for dialogue about what the author or the topic is getting across. Something called questioning the author, which is an approach by McCowan and colleagues, is really valuable because the queries in that approach are really open-ended, and it's designed to help bring out those multiple interpretations and use them as a launching place to go deeper. And And it's not a typical explicit instruction approach, but it really aligns beautifully when students have a foundational understanding, but you know that you don't want one word or simple answers. You want multiple perspectives, multiple opportunities to interpret. And as you said, you can jive off what the students are giving you. So I think it's possible to be explicit and be responsive at the same time. I think that's really clear.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that questioning the author is a really good framework. And actually, if anyone's interested, Doug Lemov wrote Reading Reconsidered, which is really heavily based on that as well. Planning and almost having an idea of what is the range of correct answers you're willing to accept. Because I think one of the things we don't want to do is, when we say there's a range of correct answers, we need to have a bit of a line around, what is an incorrect answer as well, and have that teacher skill to deal with that effectively and with, psychological safety and warmth and things like that, or utilize those incorrect answers to sort of get more information on where the misunderstandings might have arisen. So I think there's
address
a real
those
balance
misconceptions. And I think thinking about those anticipated responses and even drafting potential responses from students before you teach the lesson, or gathering what those are at the end of the first time that you teach the lesson. You might teach it multiple times in multiple years, for example. That can really improve the quality of the questioning and where you're thinking you might go. So I wonder, before we jump back into the rest of the video, is there a way for people to tell if their lessons are explicit enough, or if they're adhering to some of these principles? Are there any deal breakers in what we might be looking for in classroom practices?
Well, actually, I heard Bronwyn Ryrie-Jones the other day explain this really beautifully, and it's around checks for understanding. She said you have your long cycle, which might be your summative assessment. You've got a mid-cycle, which might be the paragraph you set for the end of the week, but you've got all these short cycle checks for understanding. So the key element of explicit direct instruction is really teaching first, and that's a big leap for a lot of teachers who are used to walking in and asking open-ended questions and fishing for student responses. So for starters, the whole TAPL, teach first, is probably the biggest shift for a lot of teachers. And then those small checks for understanding, or that real high level of interactivity with planned questions rather than questions that kind of come across by chance. So going in with a clear idea of, well, what is it exactly that I want students to know? So I think if you're starting in that vein, and then you're expecting high participation from that moment onwards. So this is actually a really good example of that, because we've got some explicit instruction around what a poem is. We've got some quality criteria, and the checks for understanding are iterative. So it's actually really high participation, even though it's not just one question that the teacher's asking, and it's not necessarily just a very short cycle. It's something that is iterated over the course of the whole lesson. So I think that sort of idea around it's also where EDI gets a bad rap. The high participation is one of the hallmarks. If your students aren't doing the cognitive work and responding for a lot of the lesson, then it's probably not being explicitly taught.
And my other takeaway, I think, in terms of a deal breaker would be, if you know that there's a gap there and you identify a misconception, that an explicit instructor won't feel shy about jumping in there and providing that explanation. I think sometimes we've been told, let the students discover things for themselves, and you might have the teacher literally, or in this case figuratively, dancing around the answer because they are feeling like it's not their role to provide it. But obviously I think that's where you do need to be responsive, and knowing that jumping in, providing that instruction, and then seeing what students can do with that information is where the balance lies, rather than saying I'm always going to let the students discover it for themselves, because that can be really inequitable to have that approach as a standard.
Or discovering that they didn't know, you taught them, but they didn't learn that expression. So I consider that a caught ball. And I think a lot of young teachers think they're a bad teacher if the students didn't get it the first time, when in fact they're a good teacher because they actually, arrested that problem, picked it up and retaught. There's a few misconceptions, I think, for teachers to get over, especially when students don't learn things for the first time. Just teach it again. It's no biggie.
All right, let's see what we make of the last bit.
So we know that when we write answers, now we've got more ideas, we can make our sentence better, can't we? Because now we've got some more of that terminology. We've got stanzas, rhyming words, mood. I like that someone said mood. So we are going to write our sentence better. It's not mean we're going to write more, we're going to write it better. Now, when we're writing a well-written sentence, what is one thing I should have? Dante.
A sentence starter.
Excellent. I need a sentence starter. And who can tell me, if I want to know how to know this is a poem, what's my sentence starter going to be? David.
This is a poem because.
Excellent. This is a poem, capital letter, because it's a well-written sentence. This is a poem Because. Okay, think of your sentence. Think about how we're going to make it better. We ready? Silence, solo go. Using our sentence starter, so it's a well-written sentence. Already see that people are adding some of those extra details in there. And showing in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and show. Before we show them, I am going to get you to do a turn talk with your partner, because I want your partner to make sure that it is a well-written sentence. Okay, does it make sense? Okay. Turn talk. Okay, showing 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and show. Good job, thank you. Can we do call? Are we ready? Aurelia, can you show your sentence, please?
This is a poem because it has 3 stanzas surrounded by night light.
What we had? What did Aurelia have that was really good in there? What did she have, Lila?
An example?
Excellent. 2 minutes for Aurelia. Good job. 2 more. Dante.
This is a poem because it doesn't have complete sentences as well as 3 stanzas.
Excellent. And what was one of the key words that Dante has used? One of the key things we've been learning about this week? Stanzas. Well done. 2 clicks. Good job. And Ayla.
This is a poem because it has 4 lines at each and has writing words like black and white.
Excellent. Good job. 2 clicks.
I think this is a strategy that would work really well in secondary, actually. I think that the older students get, the more prone they are to perfectionism. And I've heard that even in upper primary, they start to get a bit sort of precious and perfectionist about getting things perfect for the first time. But what it really does is it normalizes this editing process as just part of writing. And I think that's a really realistic way to look at it. The kids don't have computers yet. They can't edit. It's probably for the best. But they have to get used to the idea that whatever they do first is not going to be their best job. And I think that's perfectly fine. So, and I think as well, like later on, they can develop those self-regulated learning strategies. And this is part of, sort of scaffolding and that and developing those skills. But I think even getting students to comment on what they liked about other students' work, again, normalizes that people are going to listen to your work. They're going to critique it in some way. Later on, we're going to see another iteration of that where they're asked to sort of compare a sort of a less good example with a good example. We'll see that in a moment. But I think this idea that it's just work, it's like that expression, don't be afraid to kill your darlings. And I think learning that from a really young age is a great idea.
Exactly. And that revision does involve sometimes getting rid of the favorite bits. That's what the kill the darlings really means. It's, your favorite section might not still be the best section that makes that sentence or that paragraph work. So I think it is a really good practice, and mini whiteboards make that a lot easier. I loved as well the cold call came with a little bit of forewarning that it was coming, and a lot of excitement and positivity. Some people, I think, have sticks of names in their classroom, or they have a way of getting students to be called upon without raising their hands necessarily. And sometimes the teachers get as scared of it as the students do, because we've made it a negative thing, or we've caught students out by finding the students who are not paying attention and calling upon them. But I think making it positive, having that excitement about hearing from each of the students and all of the work that's led up to it, I think that really helps. Do you think there's anything else there that teachers need to think about to make this a really fun and enjoyable part of hearing from students and getting a range of answers?
I think that when Rebecca asks students to respond to what is positive about other students' work, she's putting it on the table that if she does call on you, it's just as likely to be for something positive and constructive as something that might, involve some kind of improvement. And it also creates a really high level of accountability for all the other students in the class. And then I think sometimes students find it easier to practice metacognitive skills on other people's work. And so again, that's just another way of scaffolding that process is, okay, I can step back from that student's work and think critically about it before I respond. and it's a bit more difficult to do that on your own work. But she's got all these opportunities for students to practice those particular skills, and creating a culture where people participate for all different reasons. It could be just to praise someone. It could be to pick out some, very specific feature of their work. So I think that's a really nice way of getting cold calling as not just a check for understanding, but a way to get the whole class listening, and hearing, the positive features of other people's work as well.
All right, last bit.
Good job. And Ayla.
This is a poem because it has one line at each stanza and has rhyming words like mountain line.
Excellent, good job. Could you read your very first sentence you did before that, up when we did this one?
Queensland has rhyming words and form lines at each.
Which one do you think is better? Whichever thing, which one do you think is better? The one that she wrote up here or the one down here, and then you're going to tell me why? We'll have a think why. Okay, hands up. Or nearly all hands, have a think. Have a think, why do you think? Alina, which one do you think is better?
Because she wrote
Top or bottom?
bottom.
Yeah.
Because she wrote more in the bottom and
Yeah, who can add on to that? What did she have, Javan?
she can have an example when she made them.
She did have an example. So straight away, if I didn't know what she meant by rhyming words, I know straight away because she had 2 rhyming words. Okay, very last one. Very last one. Kayla.
This is a because it has 4 lines in which stanza and has only words at the end of each line.
Excellent, Tuglik. Well done. I'm going to give you 10 seconds to read yours to make sure that you haven't missed anything.
I think it's really interesting to compare the 2 versions there. So the one student was asked to look at the first version, then the second version. It was sort of a really great example of creating that culture of improvement and feeling safe to make mistakes and then revise. So it's okay to say that one response is better than the other, because here we're actually not creating competition between students. We're actually looking at personal best and personal improvement, which is really cool.
And I think too, by comparing, you've got one that you're going to celebrate. So you're not necessarily just putting, work up on the visualizer and saying, how can we improve this? You're actually asking the students to do that work first of all, giving them a bit of instruction in between, getting them to do some, peer reviewing and peer checking as well, so that they've got all the materials they need to make it better. But then when you have the 2 versions, you're leaving them with a positive feeling about how much better it was instead of just, negative comments. I think that's one of the things with my practice is that I always have to remember to give positive comments. It's actually really difficult to remember. Yeah.
This is how you improve it. This is how you improve it. This is how you improve it. Actually, there's lots to be celebrated as well. That's
right. Yeah, it's a really difficult thing. And I work with, tough kids as well. So, tough as in, resilient kids. So it's easy to forget that they don't mind a little bit of praise when they're in year 7.
I think maybe one final thought from the video today is it's probably important to note some teachers are worried about, if I'm putting CfU questions in for checking for understanding, it's just going to eat up so much my instructional time. Like I don't have time to do a quick 3 or 4 minute one. That's not really quick because I've got so much content. In secondary, that's probably even more so the case. But I think the remembering here is that if you're really wanting to use the CfU as an opportunity to develop thinking and writing and that culture of improvement, then this is a good example for you. But you can also do your CfU really rapidly. So there's lots of options with how you embed it, so that not every CfU is going to take 3 or 4 minute sort of diversion. It can be something that is done rather quickly and responsively as well.
And I think in terms of this content argument, I don't have time to teach content. I don't have enough time. I don't have time to check for understanding. It comes out somewhere in workload. All right. So if you haven't necessarily planned to check for understanding in your lessons, it'll come out in the paragraph you've set for them to write that you're marking on the weekend. And by the time you get up to year 10, 11 and 12, it'll come out in the 4-page essay that you've asked them to write that you're also marking on the weekend. And so I think this addressing things on the spot is so much more economical. And I guess the same could be sort of extrapolated for things like whole class marking. You take away a bunch of scripts and you come back and you reteach the next day. So that's like a bit more of a delayed way of doing what Rebecca's doing in her class, is actually taking the work away, reading through it, coming up with a list of common areas and then teaching to those and having specific targets around that perhaps the next day and rewriting the next day. And I think that it's an illusion of saving time. It really doesn't save time in the long run. And I think that checking it on the spot requires more responsiveness than being able to take things away on the weekend, take them for a little ride in the car home and mark them and bring them back. But I think it's really not economical for teachers, and it's something that I think workload-wise and just for our profession, we're going to have to shift, I think.
The main thing is you get better at your teaching, like you make better choices if you are doing even brief CfU, so 30 seconds or 1 minute sort of interludes where you are checking for understanding verbally or in a written sort of form, for example. And those better decisions will enable you to ensure that your lessons really land. If you're finding your CFUs are not working, then it tells you to go back and address some challenges in your instruction. Maybe there's prior knowledge your students really don't have and you need to backfill it. Maybe that lesson on poetry that you did last week really didn't land, and you need to actually revisit it before you use that knowledge as a basis for the next thing. And as you said, it will accumulate if we miss those potential gaps that need to be filled.
Yeah. So each episode, Nathaniel and I are going to be talking about our takeaways, so the kinds of things we're going to take into our practice in the following week. And because we're both practicing teachers, watching these clips is just as valuable for us as we hope it is for you. We're going to set a goal for our own practice that we can go off and apply based on all the brilliant instruction we've seen by Rebecca today. And we're so lucky to be able to see this as part of our own professional growth. So Nathaniel, what's your goal for the week?
Well, Beck, I'm planning to alternate how I use my CFU. So I do follow TAPL quite a bit because I'm often trying to model that for colleagues or for teachers that are visiting the classrooms that I'm working in. But I do want to try getting students to write their responses first on a mini whiteboard or in a booklet, and then pair share to provide some feedback, and then see how that changes and gives an opportunity to build some more writing practice into each lesson as well.
Great.
What are you thinking of?
Well, I actually tried Rebecca's strategy today with a visualizer, and it was actually great fun. Good one for a period 5 at the end of the day. But my goal this week is to actually reduce the amount of routines that I use, so behavior and response routines. And I really want to nail the ones that I'm using, so have fewer and do them better. So I've got a prac student at the moment who's with me, and I've given her my paddle pop sticks to use, and it reminds me that I should be using them because she's the one who's calling the names, and I need to keep her busy. So her being there is a visual reminder to keep those response routines a bit more restricted than I usually would, because I think it's really easy to pick up brand new things. You know, you and I in our practice and with our own professional learning, we're always seeing these cool new techniques. It's actually really hard to embed them with fidelity. And so, yeah, mine's about doing fewer things really well.
So declutter your routines as well as probably declutter your brain.
Yeah.
Sounds great.
Well, Nathaniel, I look forward to catching up with you again for our next episode, which is going to be with Manisha Gazula from Marsden Road Public School.
And if you've been listening and enjoying at home, we do want to hear from you. We'd love to hear your feedback and the questions that this raises. And also, we are interested to look at more clips of your practice. So if you have small clips of practice that you'd like to share with us and you're allowed to share them with a wider audience, we'd love to include them on our show.
Yes. We'll see you in a couple of weeks.
See you soon.